The courtroom doors opened and people streamed inside, each one buzzing with anticipation. This wasn't just another trial. This was the one everyone had been waiting for, the kind of case that could change careers, reputations, maybe even lives. On one side sat Judge Thomas, a man known for his iron fist and unshakable authority. He had a reputation for being decisive, often ruthless, and today he looked like he was ready to cement that image once and for all. On the other side sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, steady in her seat, her eyes calm but focused. She knew the storm was about to hit, but there wasn't the slightest tremor in her demeanor. The air felt heavy, thick with tension, as Judge Thomas cleared his throat and prepared to speak. His words came slowly at first, deliberate, almost taunting. Then, with a voice that filled the chamber, he announced the ruling that no one expected. A fine, $500 million. $500 million, placed squarely on the shoulders of one woman. The sound of it rolled through the room like a thunderclap. People gasped, reporters froze mid-sentence, and even seasoned lawyers blinked in disbelief. $500 million. It didn't sound like justice. It sounded like a sentence meant to destroy. For a brief second, the weight of it lingered in the air. Judge Thomas leaned back, his face unreadable but his posture radiating confidence, as though he had just ended the fight before it even began. He seemed certain Jasmine would buckle under the pressure, that she'd falter, maybe even beg. But she didn't. She slowly rose to her feet, her hands steady, her voice unwavering. Instead of anger, there was calm. Instead of fear, there was clarity. She looked directly at the judge, and with the entire courtroom hanging on her next words, she began to speak. Her words weren't rushed. They weren't loud. They were measured, deliberate, every syllable carrying more weight than the fine itself. She spoke of fairness, of the duty of the court, of the sacred responsibility judges carry. She reminded everyone listening that justice isn't meant to break people, it's meant to protect them. She told the judge, in no uncertain terms, that power without principle is nothing more than tyranny. And as she spoke, something shifted. The reporters picked up their pens again, racing to capture every line. Spectators leaned in, their whispers growing with each sentence. Judge Thomas tried to hold his composure, but the cracks were showing. What was supposed to be a display of absolute authority was now slipping away. Jasmine wasn't yelling. She wasn't pleading. She was dismantling. Each word was a scalpel, cutting into the very foundation of the ruling. The fine, outrageous and unjust, was no longer the story. The story was her. The longer she spoke, the more the energy in the courtroom turned. People exchanged glances, nods, quiet murmurs of agreement. You could feel it in the air. The tide had shifted. She wasn't just defending herself anymore. She was pulling the entire room to her side. By the time she finished, even those who had walked in doubting her found themselves clapping silently in their minds, awed by the sheer courage it took to stand calm in the face of crushing force. And when she sat back down, the silence was deafening. Not the silence of defeat, but the silence of realization. Everyone in that room knew they had just witnessed something extraordinary. A fine might have been written into the record, but the record that mattered most, the one in the minds and hearts of the people, belonged to her. Judge Thomas thought he had delivered the final blow, but instead, he had handed Jasmine Crockett the stage. In that courtroom, one man had the gavel, but one woman had the truth. And the truth, calm and steady, turned the entire room against the very authority that tried to break her. Sometimes, the loudest verdict isn't the one written in law books. It's the one carried out in the hearts of the people who see injustice for what it is. And on that day, in that courtroom, the people had chosen their side. They weren't with the judge. They were with Jasmine Crockett. The weight of the judge's words still hung in the air, but as Jasmine Crockett took her seat again, something strange began to happen. The courtroom, moments ago shocked into silence, started to breathe differently. Whispers rippled across the benches, not whispers of fear, but whispers of doubt, doubt aimed at Judge Thomas himself. For years, he had commanded rooms with his voice, his rulings, his authority. But now, People were beginning to see past the black robe and gavel. They were beginning to see the man beneath, and the cracks in his power. Judge Thomas cleared his throat, trying to reassert control. He pounded his gavel once, the sound echoing through the chamber like a warning shot. But it was too late. The energy had shifted. People weren't looking at him with reverence anymore. They were looking at him with suspicion. And all of it because Jasmine Crockett hadn't broken. She had stood her ground, and her calm confidence was louder than his decree. Jasmine leaned forward slightly, her hands folded neatly, her eyes locked on the bench. She didn't raise her voice, but her presence filled the room. When she spoke again, it wasn't just to defend herself. It was to remind everyone present what the court was supposed to be. "This room," she said, her tone steady and deliberate, "is meant to serve the people, not to intimidate them, not to punish them unjustly. Justice doesn't have a price tag, and if it did, $500 million wouldn't buy it." The crowd stirred. Even members of the press, trained to stay neutral, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The cameras caught every angle, every expression. Some jurors looked down at their hands, others directly at the judge, their eyes quietly questioning him in a way they never had before. Judge Thomas gripped his gavel tighter. He wanted to cut her off, to remind her who held the authority, but deep down, he knew that silencing her now would only make him look weaker. So he sat there, stewing in silence, as Crockett's words washed over the room like a tide. Then came the line that would echo long after the hearing ended. "You can find me every dollar on paper, Judge. But you cannot find me my voice. And you cannot find me the truth." It was as if the entire courtroom exhaled at once. The weight of the fine suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the force of her conviction. Jasmine Crockett wasn't crushed by the $500 million figure. She had turned it into proof of how broken the system could be when unchecked power went unchallenged. For the first time, it was clear. Judge Thomas might have signed the ruling, but Jasmine Crockett had captured the courtroom. The moment Jasmine Crockett finished speaking, it was as if a spark had ignited inside the courtroom. What had begun as gasps of disbelief over the staggering fine had now transformed into something far more dangerous for Judge Thomas: doubt, spreading like wildfire. People weren't just questioning the size of the penalty anymore. They were questioning the very integrity of the man who had imposed it. Reporters leaned closer to their cameras, whispering updates into microphones, their eyes wide with the realization that this wasn't just another trial, it was turning into a reckoning. Social media, fed by live streams and quick clips, began to flood with reactions. Hashtags with Crockett's name started trending. Viewers at home tweeted things like, *, she just turned the whole courtroom against him. *, others wrote, *, this isn't a trial anymore. This is history. *, inside the chamber, the tension grew heavier with each passing second. Judge Thomas adjusted his glasses, his jaw clenched. He tried to project control, but it was slipping. The more he sat in silence, the more his authority felt hollow. His gavel no longer seemed like a symbol of order. It seemed like a shield, and everyone could see it. Jasmine, however, was unshaken. She didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. Instead, she carried herself with the same quiet dignity that had carried her through the storm. She turned slightly, not just toward the judge, but toward the entire room, her words carefully chosen to resonate with everyone listening. The law is supposed to serve the people equally. If punishment is to be given, it must be fair. And if judgment is to be passed, it must be just. $500 million is not justice. It is intimidation. And intimidation has no place in this court. A murmur of approval rolled through the crowd. The bailiff gave a sharp glance to the audience, but even he couldn't suppress the flicker of agreement in his eyes. It was becoming harder and harder to ignore the truth. The courtroom no longer belonged to the judge. It belonged to the woman standing in front of him. Crockett looked directly at him one last time, her voice low but steady enough to carry through every corner of the chamber. History doesn't remember the fines, Judge. It remembers the truth. And today, this courtroom has seen it. That line echoed, not just in the room, but across millions of screens. People watching at home felt it. The press repeated it in headlines. It was the kind of sentence that doesn't just end an argument, it defines it. And in that defining moment, Judge Thomas realized what everyone else already knew. He may have signed the fine, but Jasmine Crockett had signed her legacy. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had swelled into the hundreds. Reporters with cameras and microphones waited eagerly, while citizens who had followed the trial streamed live on their phones, eager to capture the moment as Jasmine Crockett stepped through the doors. For hours, they had been buzzing with disbelief at the fine. But now, after watching her words spread across every screen, their disbelief had turned into admiration. The instant she appeared, a wave of sound erupted. Cheers, chants, people shouting her name. It wasn't the reaction of a defeated woman walking away from a crushing penalty. It was the reception of a leader who had just exposed something bigger than herself. She raised a hand in acknowledgement, calm as ever, and the crowd roared louder. Across the street, news anchors stood in front of cameras, their voices hurried with excitement. "What we've witnessed here today," one reporter said, "is unprecedented." A $500 million fine meant to silence Jasmine Crockett has instead amplified her voice louder than ever before. This is no longer just a courtroom story. This is a national story. Inside Judge Thomas's chambers, the atmosphere was different. His aides whispered nervously. Jasmine Crockett didn't just face the fine. She turned the whole court against the man who tried to break her. Days turned into weeks, but the shockwaves from that courtroom never faded. The fine of $500 million still sat on paper like a mountain, but in the eyes of the people, it had already crumbled to dust. Everywhere Jasmine went, she was met with gratitude, admiration, and respect. Strangers stopped her on the street just to say, "You gave us hope." News outlets couldn't stop covering the fallout. Legal scholars called the ruling one of the most reckless judgments in recent history. Former judges came forward, questioning Thomas's motives. Petitions with millions of signatures demanded an investigation. And slowly, the pressure that Jasmine had refused to bow to shifted onto the judge who had tried to bury her. Behind closed doors, Judge Thomas found himself more isolated than ever. His once unquestioned authority was now stained with doubt. Colleagues whispered about corruption, politicians distanced themselves, and his name became synonymous with arrogance. In trying to silence one voice, he had unleashed millions. Meanwhile, Jasmine didn't celebrate with anger or revenge. She stayed true to the calm, measured tone that had defined her from the start. She spoke about reform, about fairness, about a justice system that belonged to the people, not just to those who sat on the highest benches. Her words weren't fiery outbursts. They were steady sparks, lighting up conversations across the nation. Universities invited her to speak. Community groups rallied behind her. Even those who had once doubted her found themselves inspired. And slowly, something remarkable happened. The fine that was meant to destroy her instead became the very thing that elevated her into a symbol of courage. One night, sitting in a quiet room away from the noise, Jasmine reflected on it all. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. One night, sitting in a quiet room away from the noise, Jasmine reflected on it all. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The fine still hung over her. The fight for justice was far from over, and the system she challenged was vast. But she also knew something more powerful. The people had seen the truth. They had witnessed her calm in the storm, her refusal to break, her ability to turn a courtroom of whispers into a movement of voices. And sometimes, that is how history changes, not with a single verdict, but with the courage of one person who refuses to be silent. In the end, Judge Thomas's gavel may have struck the desk, but Jasmine Crockett struck something far greater. She struck a chord in the hearts of millions. And long after the fine is forgotten, her defiance, her composure, and her unwavering belief in justice will be remembered. Because true power doesn't come from the bench. It comes from the people who refuse to bow, even when the cost seems impossible. And Jasmine Crockett proved that sometimes the calmest voice in the room can roar the loudest.